is that? See this. So Aristotle's virtue ethics. Again, I think that it's not an either-or situation. Are you going to go with something like virtue ethics, or boy, what is it? At any rate, it's like, are you going to go with virtue ethics, or are you going to go with a theory that that we call a theory of obligation, that tries to give you a decision procedure for working out what to do? What's the right thing to do in this situation? I got a choice between A and B. How do I figure it out ethically and defend the choice I make philosophically? Well, later in the course, we'll see Kantian ethics and utilitarianism try to do exactly that. Give us the means of working out our moral duty in these particular situations. And even though the utilitarians went out of their way to say that their theory is not anti-religious, because remember, they're writing in England, in a Christian country where the Church of England reigns. And even though Kant was a believer in God, the theories, Kant's theory can be used without bringing in any kind of premises, of theological premises about God. And likewise, utilitarianism was meant to be a secular ethic. And so both of those have been popular, but they both are what we call theories of obligation. They give us a decision procedure for figuring out what we're obligated to do ethically in a given situation. But the ancients were more concerned with what is a good life for a human being? What is it to live a moral life? And specifically, what kind of character traits are exhibited by a good human being? And we saw this in Plato, right? Plato goes out of his way to say, if reason rules over the appetitive element, over the appetites, we can cultivate the moral virtue of temperance or self-control over the desires of our lower nature. If reason rules over the spirited element, the emotional part of us, we can do things like keep our anger in check. You know, somebody cuts us off on the road and we don't go into a rage. We peg it philosophically, right? So Plato, even before Aristotle, was very interested in this idea. And even before Plato, Socrates was. Socrates said at his trial, look, you all are saying that I'm corrupting the youth by leading them away after other gods, or teaching them to be atheists, or teaching them to be bad arguers, and having them imitate my confrontational style. You know what I'm really teaching them, Socrates says? I'm teaching them not to value wealth and their position in their career as much as they value being a good person. He says, look, I'm not down on wealth, but you can have wealth without being a good person. But he says, think first about what it is to be a good human being, and then the other stuff is going to follow. And so we find this emphasis in the Greeks on character traits. What is the good life for a human being? What is it for a human being to be a good human being? And Aristotle, I think, has the most developed view of that. Now, we're not going to go into what he calls intellectual virtues. But basically, we're going to see that he thinks we are essentially rational animals. We are reasoning beings. And it's funny, one of my backgammon players sitting next to me, he's very, very intelligent. He's a chiropractor. And he was talking about something they did with dogs, where the dog, in order to solve the puzzle, had to do some deductive reasoning. And I made a comment. I said, well, that would have really messed up Aristotle if he'd have seen the results of that experiment, because according to him, we're the rational beings, right? So he thinks that, we'll see, essentially we're reasoning beings. And so if that's our ultimate purpose, is to be rational animals, then we're happiest when we're living our life in accord with reason by having intellectual pursuits, right, and cultivating what he calls the intellectual virtues, and also cultivating, as we'll see, the moral virtues, because reason comes into play here. Just as reason in Plato enabled us, to keep the desires of the two lower natures in check, the appetitive and the emotional part. So reason in Aristotle is what enables us to live the moral life by cultivating the particular moral virtues he talks about. Excuse me. So we're not going to worry so much about intellectual virtues, but they're there. But moral virtues are concerned with character traits, and Aristotle is extremely practical. We don't acquire these virtues by putting on a relaxation tape, some ambient music, and going into a state of deep meditation, and when we come out of it, all of a sudden we're more courageous than we were. We've developed courage in ourselves, or we've developed temperance. No, I mean, for him, the way you acquire these virtues is by real interactions with real people in the real world, by making choices in accordance with those virtues. And it's kind of a circular thing. Basically, you have actions like actions where that are required, where courage is required, and you make courageous decisions. Actions where where temperance is called for. And so we'll see for him, you produce a character trait than by acting specifically in a certain way. But then it kind of comes full circle. The idea is if you've developed, if you've made yourself into a more temperate person, you know, I really need to get things under control in this area of my life. And so you do actions against what you've been doing. You make more temperate choices. You develop temperance. But then he says when you've developed the character trait, then it becomes easier to act from your inner character and in the future make decisions that are in accord with that character trait you've developed. So they're acquired by habit, and that was the point of the endless piano player in the video. And sometimes people miss the point here. Now, I'm over there in humanities with the music people, and sometimes they will sell music in the curriculum by saying, well, learning how to play a musical instrument can help you in other areas of life. But that's not Aristotle's point. He's not saying that learning how to play the lyre will give you some skills that help you in other ways. But he's developing an analogy. He's saying producing a character trait, developing a character trait by habitual action is very much like developing the skill to play a musical instrument. You don't do it overnight. You don't read a book on how to play the piano and, you know, all of a sudden, you know, next week you're playing Mozart, you know. These skills are developed over time. And so that's kind of the point then, is that developing character traits, it's the same process as that you use in, say, developing skill at playing a musical instrument. And sometimes we have to act contrary to nature, right? If we're going to develop self-control, we got to say, well, okay, you know, I'll have one of those cupcakes, but not 3 or 4, or something like that. So they're acquired by exercising them, and here we get one of the things I have in my home is a little knick-knack shelf that my dad built. After World War II, my dad was a painter, and his asthma was bothering him, so my mother, who was very wise for most of her life, said, why don't you go back, get training under the GI Bill to do something else? And so he trained to become a carpenter. You know, but to be able to do what he did well, he had to develop some of those skills. And that knick-knack shelf that I have is one of the ways that he developed skill at building things, you know, building some stuff for the carpentry course. So we learn to build by building. We learn to play a musical instrument like the lyre by playing it, and we become just persons by doing just actions, is Aristotle's claim. And in a practical sense, it works. So again, for him, we're also a social being. So we don't become moral in isolation. We don't become moral by contemplating some ethereal form of the good or goodness itself, or contemplating the form of temperance. Remember, for Aristotle, there is no separately existing world of the forms. And as a consequence, there's no form of the good there. Forms do exist. He does believe that things have essential natures, but they exist only as they are embodied in particular objects, in particulars. So, again, to repeat a point I made, the difference between Plato and Aristotle on the forms is often pointed out is that if all the tables went out of existence, for Plato, you'd still have the eternal form of tableness in this other realm. For Aristotle, if all the tables went out of existence, since the only way the form of tableness can exist is embodied in particular tables, take away all the tables, the form goes too. So we become morally just by performing just acts in our transactions with other human beings, not by private meditation. Now, here's, I think, an area where Aristotle really broke some new ground in his model of what a virtue is. Because for him, and here you see the golden mean coming out. For him, a virtue is always the mean or the midpoint between two vices. On the one hand, you get a vice of deprivation, and at the other extreme, you get a vice of excess. So moral virtue then is the mean between excess and deprivation for these areas. And, okay, I know some people are already writing on this. So it's not either you're virtuous or you're not virtuous, but virtue is walking the moderate mean. So this kind of gives an indication of what he thinks is the virtuous life. If virtues themselves are developed by following the midway course, not going to extremes, then for him, the virtuous life is a life of moderation. Now, this absolutely goes against what some people want to say, right? For some people, the best life we can live is a life lived to the extreme in one way or another. Whereas for Aristotle, it's not. And we'll see for him, the happiest life is a life of moderation. So, take a particular virtue like temperance. We saw that Plato talks about temperance as well. So it's the mean between denial of the body's appetites, what we call asceticism, and on the other hand, self-indulgence or gluttony. So it's taking the midway course between these two extremes. And when I was in college, it really wasn't that far. If you think of, it was about the same distance from World War II as it is now from, say, the first Gulf War. And so some of my professors had gone through that war. And my Greek professor had gone through the war, and people did reacted two ways. They were like my father, who never talked about World War II. And we kind of knew, don't bring it up. Right? He was in the Army Air Corps. And they also did civil defense when he was stationed in England. He'd wake up with nightmares about evacuating people from bombed out burning buildings that the Nazis had bombed in England. And so at any rate, courage for Aristotle is not total fearlessness. You know, in playing backgammon, sometimes you have to have the courage to make the right move. But one of the things you see in inexperienced players is they take too many chances. Although the tendency in new players is to go the other way and don't take the chances you should, the calculated risks you should, to develop your game. At any rate, to get back to my Greek professor, he had a story. They had a younger kid who came into the unit, and they're in a firefight with the Germans, and this kid stands up like they see in the movies, starts shooting at him, gets shot himself. You know, now some people would say, well, that's not necessarily courage. That's kind of foolhardiness. That's being foolish. You know, and you know, likewise, the person who takes too many risks in backgammon when they shouldn't. You know, you learn more about the game. You learn this criteria for taking risks and not taking risks. So, you know, that example that my Greek professor gave was a good example of maybe foolhardiness. So, courage is not fearing nothing, or foolhardiness, and making bad decisions as a result. It's not, obviously, it's not total fear and being afraid to take an action that requires courage. But for him, it's keeping our fear in check. And again, how do we do this? Well, you know, for Aristotle, it's using our reasoning abilities to do what we know we ought to be doing. You know, so it's controlling our fear. So the mean sometimes is achieved contrary to what nature tells us. Nature tells us to be overly cautious, but our reason tells us we need to fight our fear and make a courageous decision. Nature tells us, oh, have another piece of pie. And reason tells us, keep it at one. You know, so the mean is achieved then for Aristotle by reason. So this is how reason, you know, comes into play in his ethics. Now, what we get in the ancients is an assumption that has gone by the wayside, especially post-Darwin. And that is the assumption that we can draw a sharp line between human beings and everything else in nature at reason or reasoning abilities. For the ancients, and especially for Aristotle, reason, human reason, is different in kind than anything we find in non-human animals. Now, of course, the tendency post-Darwin is to say, well, wait a second, dolphins have some reasoning abilities, higher primates, like chimpanzees, have some reasoning abilities. And as the bumper stickers indicate, my border collie is smarter than your honor student. You know, some dogs are very smart, right? And, you know, the tendency post-Darwin is to see the difference between human reason and the reason of non-human animals as a difference only of degree. It might be more developed, but it's not something entirely and totally different. But for Aristotle, it is. And some of what he means by reason is the idea to act from a reason, to act from reasons, the ability to understand a rational argument in support of a conclusion, and these he thinks non-human animals don't have. And when we look at Immanuel Kant's ethics, we see somebody in the 19th century who still is very confident that we can draw a very sharp line between human beings and non-human animals. So this is the way Aristotle describes things. And we'll see Aquinas, very influenced by Aristotle, because the works of Aristotle had been suppressed for years. The early Christians liked Plato. They weren't too keen on Aristotle. And some of the books that got torched were works of Aristotle. Oddly enough, they were preserved in the Arab world by Muslim scholars. And they were rediscovered during the Crusades. And this was happening during Aquinas' time. And now, all of a sudden, this stuff that the Western world had lost for 1,000 years, they're now confronted with. What do we do with this? And so Aquinas tries to reconcile his Christian beliefs with Aristotle's philosophy. So here is Aristotle saying that plants have biological functions. Non-human animals have more than that. They not only have bodies in which biological functions take place, but they have an emotional life. They are what we call sentient creatures. But he says that's not how we determine how we are unique. And very often the essential features of something are what make it unique. If we talk about a knife, for Aristotle, its essential, its technique, its essential function is to cut stuff, right? The essential function of a ballpoint pen is to write on paper. The essential function of a piece of chalk is to write on a chalkboard, right? In other words, our essence. Remember, Aristotle still thinks things have essential natures. It's just that these essential natures don't exist in some airy, ethereal other realm like they did for Plato. Usually our essential nature is defined by something that's unique to it, right? This is meant to cut. This isn't. All right? And so he says, in the same way, we can ask of human beings, well, what's their unique characteristic? And if we can identify what's absolutely unique to human beings, we can identify their essential nature. So he says, well, look, obviously what's unique to human beings can't be what we share with the plants, biological functions, right? Because even plants have that. And he says it can't be just having an emotional life and being aware of our surroundings, which presumably plants don't have unless you're talking about science fiction. But Aristotle says here's where we're unique, in this last thing. We're reasoning beings, so reason in human beings sets us apart from non-human animals. It is our essential nature. So, and when we're talking virtues, we're also talking living life excellently, right? In search of excellence, as the book says. We, if we're preparing dinner and I got to cut through a chicken bone or something, and I say, you know what, reach me that chef's knife over there. That is a really virtuous knife. You'd say, what do you mean by a virtuous knife? Well, we don't talk that way, right? We do. But for Greeks, the same word used for the excellence of an inanimate object like a knife is the same word used for moral excellence or virtue. So the virtue of a thing, the excellence of a thing. Now, we don't talk about a virtuous knife, but we do talk about a good knife, and there could be non-moral and moral forms of goodness. So we're not that far away. So the excellence of a thing is its virtue. The essential function of a knife is to cut. A virtuous knife, a good knife, is a knife that performs its function well, that cuts well, right? And so if we're going to live an excellent life, we need to live a life where our reason governs the rest of us. So now it seems like he's going against this because what is the chief point of being moral? Why be moral? And what is the chief standard for moral goodness? Well, we saw for Plato, it was this abstract form in the heavens called the form of the good, or goodness itself. For Aristotle, Aristotle's much more practical. He says the good life is a life of happiness. The word is eudaimonia. I'm not going to ask it. What is it? I'm trying to remember. E-U-D-A-E-M-O-N-I-A. I'm pretty sure that's right. I was almost going to write it in Greek. I thought, maybe I'm not going to understand it in Greek letters. Let's write it in English. It's more than just a feel-good happiness, right? Well, Martha Nussbaum was saying she likes the translation "human flourish." Yeah. So how do you live a successful life as a person? That is your virtue for Aristotle. So he says, aligning ourselves with virtuous behavior is going to make us happiest in this life. So one of my old department chairs pointed out that the old cliche, virtue is its own reward, really works if you're talking somebody like Aristotle, right? In other words, why be moral? For Aristotle, it's look, you're going to live a better life if you live a moral life. Now, we're not always pitched that view, you know, but this is Aristotle's view. So to do noble and good deeds is desirable for its own sake, and the virtuous life is the happiest life, the most satisfying life. But again, if virtue is walking the middle ground between extremes, then virtue is walking that moderate mean. And you know what? I mean, since I'm not 25 anymore, and I've known a lot of different people over the years, I hate to say it, but I don't think when I was your age I would have been convinced by this point of Aristotle's. I would have said, no, the life to be pursued is one of just going to excess in this or that direction to seek, your path in life and success and throw everything else to the wind. Whereas Aristotle is saying, no, the best life is a well-rounded life, a life lived following the moderate mean. But as I get up there and the people I've seen who seem to be the most self-satisfied, happy people are the people whose lives are basically that. They're not necessarily overboard in any one direction, but they live a very well-balanced, moderate life. And they seem to be satisfied with things. So the happiest life is the virtuous life, but that's walking the moderate mean between extremes. So that means the happiest life is the moderate life for him. And again, how do we develop these character traits? Well, by allowing reason habitually to govern the choices we make and make the moderate choices. So, question, comments? Well, this is one view of ethics, and we'll, let it go there. But you'll see in the video I'm going to show now on some of these arguments for the existence of God, the influence both of Plato and Aristotle. Again, we're covering these things from different points of view. Okay, we're going to talk about whether you can prove God, but we're also going to talk about the problem of evil, whether the existence of evil in the world means God is normally conceived can't be around if we have a world like this world, So we're going to cover both sides of the fence there. Okay. You know what? Hold on. I can't recall if I I did put it in. Let's see how this plays on the computer. If it's not playing very well, I'll take it out and put it elsewhere. I got to go to the second one on this. This a real metaphysical one. Is time real?